They laughed at me when I borrowed $100, said I'd never make it, that I was chasing another hopeless dream. Back then, I didn't even have enough for gas, and their laughter echoed louder than my hunger. But what they didn't know was that one small loan would start something they could never imagine. And years later, when I stood in front of them owning the very bank they once mocked me for walking into, all I saw was silence. My family always believed that money defined worth. If you didn't wear brands, drive something shiny, or post your vacations online, you were simply a failure in their eyes. Every family gathering felt like a competition: who earned more, who bought what, who traveled where. And there I was, sitting in the corner, pretending to laugh along, hiding the fact that my bank account was nearly empty. I had just lost my job at the time, my company downsized, and I was one of the unlucky ones. When I told them, they didn't offer comfort or understanding. They exchanged glances that said more than words ever could. Bills piled up faster than I could think. I skipped dinners, telling myself I wasn't hungry when, in truth, I couldn't afford groceries that week. My old phone's screen was cracked in 3 places, but I kept using it, pretending it was fine whenever anyone noticed. My mother once joked, maybe if you stopped being so lazy, your luck would change, and everyone laughed. I laughed too, just to blend in, even though it burned inside. Every time I called or texted my siblings, they'd ignore me for days, only replying when they had some story to brag about: new jobs, cars, vacations. I'd listen, nod, and congratulate them like a good brother, but deep down, I felt invisible. When I finally asked to borrow a small amount, just $100 to get through the month, I could hear the smirk in my brother's voice over the phone. You? Borrowing money? What for? Another one of your dreams? He chuckled, and I remember the silence that followed after I said thank you anyway. They saw me as a failure, someone who talked big but achieved nothing. And in a family obsessed with status, being broke wasn't just unfortunate, it was shameful. But even through that humiliation, something in me stayed quiet and observant. I didn't know it then, but their laughter that day would become the sound that fueled my determination. The idea came to me one night as I sat alone in my dimly lit apartment, surrounded by overdue bills and empty coffee cups. I had spent weeks searching for jobs, sending out resumes, hearing nothing back. That silence forced me to think differently. I remembered how, at my old job, the local bank had struggled with outdated customer systems, and how I'd once suggested a small software solution to simplify their process, an idea they ignored. That memory sparked something. What if I built a digital system that could help small banks modernize, save money, and manage clients better? It was ambitious, but it wasn't impossible. The next day, I told my family. I still remember their faces, blank for a second, and then filled with laughter. My father leaned back in his chair, shaking his head, saying, "You? Build a banking system? You couldn't even keep a job." My older brother smirked and added, "So now you think you're some kind of tech genius? What's next, buying the whole bank?" My mother just sighed, muttering something about me needing to get a real job instead of chasing fantasies. It wasn't just disbelief, it was mockery coated in fake concern. The words cut deep. These were the people who were supposed to believe in me, to see potential where the world didn't. Instead, I became their dinner joke. My sister texted me later that night, saying, "I know you mean well, but you always get these crazy ideas. Just focus on finding stable work, okay?" It was the kindness in her tone that hurt the most, as if she was consoling a lost cause. I spent that evening sitting by the window, staring out at the quiet city lights, replaying their laughter over and over in my head. I felt foolish for even sharing my dream. For a moment, I considered giving up. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was just chasing illusions to escape my failures. But then, I thought about what failure really meant. To them, it meant not having money. To me, it was about giving up before even trying. So, I decided I'd prove them wrong. Even if I failed, I wanted to fail chasing something I believed in, not living under their expectations. I took that same cracked phone, sold what little I could, and gathered enough to start coding from my old laptop. Each night, as my family's laughter echoed in my memory, I wrote lines of code like they were lines of defiance. Their disbelief had become my drive, their mockery my motivation. Because deep down, I knew, one day, they'd remember every word they said, and I'd be there to remind them how wrong they were. The first few months were brutal. I worked out of my tiny apartment, using an old, overheating laptop that crashed every few hours. My days bled into nights, and sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. I survived on cheap instant noodles and black coffee, my fingers numb from typing, my mind constantly juggling code, bills, and doubt. There were moments when I stared blankly at the screen, wondering if my family had been right, maybe I really was wasting my time. Every rejection email hit harder than the last. Banks, startups, even small credit firms, they all turned me down. Some didn't reply at all. One manager even told me, "You're just a guy with a dream and no team, we can't risk that." I hung up that call and sat in silence for an hour, feeling the weight of every sneer and smirk my family had ever given me. I'd borrowed $100 to start this journey, and now, months later, I had nothing to show for it except empty ramen cups and a head full of unfinished code. Still, something inside me refused to quit. Each rejection taught me something new, how to refine my pitch, improve my system, and make it leaner, faster, smarter. I spent nights watching free online tutorials, reading open source code, and debugging until dawn. My electricity bill went unpaid twice, and I remember working in the dark once, my laptop screen the only light in the room. Friends stopped calling. Family stopped asking how I was doing. Maybe they were tired of hearing the same story, maybe I was too. The few times I met my family, their attitude hadn't changed. My brother would ask, "So, did you sell your $1 million app yet?" with a mocking grin. My mother just looked disappointed, as if my stubbornness embarrassed her. I learned to stay quiet, smile, and leave early. But inside, I was crumbling, half from exhaustion, half from loneliness. I had poured everything into something no one believed in, not even me some nights. Then, one evening, while scrolling through forums, I stumbled upon a small community bank in a nearby town looking for freelance tech help. They wanted someone to create a basic client management tool, simple, but exactly what I had been building. My hands trembled as I sent the proposal. I didn't expect a response, but the next morning, there it was, an email that simply said, "Let's talk." I worked tirelessly for that client, rewriting code, fixing bugs, and adding features they hadn't even asked for. When I finally sent the finished product, the manager called me personally. His voice was full of genuine surprise and appreciation. "This is exactly what we needed," he said. They paid me $800, not a fortune, but to me, it was everything. It wasn't just about the money, it was proof that my idea had value, that someone finally saw what I saw. When I shared the news with my family, hoping for a flicker of pride, my brother just said, $800? After all those months? You could have made more flipping burgers. They laughed, and for a moment, it almost broke me again. But that time, I didn't feel small. I felt steady. Because for the first time, I didn't need their validation. I had something better, proof that I could stand on my own. And though they didn't know it yet, that single client was the first brick in the empire I was quietly building. The real turning point came about 6 months after that first small success. The little community bank I'd helped had recommended me to another local branch in a nearby city. Word was spreading quietly, but steadily. My inbox began to fill with small inquiries, questions, demo requests, price estimates. I wasn't earning much yet, but for the first time, I saw momentum. Still, I knew I needed something bigger, a real breakthrough, to move beyond these small projects. One afternoon, while presenting my system to a potential client at a local business fair, I met a man named Victor, a retired banker turned investor. He wasn't flashy like my family's friends, but sharp-eyed and calm, the kind of man who listened before he spoke. After my presentation, he walked up, handed me his card, and said, "Your idea has teeth. You just need capital and structure. Call me when you're ready to scale." I didn't sleep that night. I kept turning his words over in my head. Capital and structure, two things I didn't have. But I had something else, persistence. So, I gathered my courage, wrote a detailed proposal, and sent it to him the next morning. 2 days later, he called. We met over coffee in a quiet cafe, and I showed him everything, my designs, the working prototype, the results from the small banks that had already used it. He didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he simply nodded and said, "You've built something solid. I'll fund your expansion, but on one condition, you stay involved in every decision. This should remain your vision." It felt unreal. Victor invested enough for me to hire 2 developers and rent a small workspace. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was building. Within months, we improved the system, added automation tools, and launched a subscription model for small financial institutions. The response was better than I'd dreamed. 3, then 5, then 10 banks signed on. Monthly revenue doubled, then tripled. Yet, I stayed quiet. I didn't buy new clothes, didn't post success online, didn't even tell my family. I still lived in my small apartment, cooked noodles when I could, and kept my cracked phone. I wanted to protect what I was building, let it grow away from their noise. Victor became my mentor, guiding me through contracts, negotiations, and decisions. He once told me, "The moment you start proving people wrong, don't rub it in, let your silence speak for you." Those words became my mantra. Each new client brought me closer to freedom, not just financial but emotional. The laughter that once haunted me now fueled my discipline. I didn't crave applause anymore, I craved progress. And though my family still saw me as the broke dreamer who couldn't hold a job, I knew something they didn't, the foundation of something much greater was already taking shape beneath their radar. They just hadn't seen it yet. Success didn't arrive overnight, it crept in quietly, like dawn breaking after years of darkness. One day I was still checking my phone to make sure payments from small banks had gone through, and the next, I was managing contracts from across the country. The software I'd built, born from hunger, humiliation, and long nights, had become something real. Within 2 years, my company was servicing over 100 local banks and financial institutions. I hired a proper team, leased an office in the city, and replaced that old, dying laptop with one that didn't overheat after every few hours. The numbers kept climbing. What started as a single line of code in my tiny apartment had turned into a thriving enterprise. Revenue tripled, then quadrupled. I reinvested every cent, into development, marketing, and hiring smart, loyal people who believed in the mission. My mentor, Victor, watched with quiet pride but reminded me constantly, stay grounded. The moment ego walks in, clarity walks out. I never forgot that. Still, success has a strange silence to it. The same family who once mocked me hadn't reached out in months. Maybe they assumed I was still struggling. That was fine, I preferred it that way. The less they knew, the more peaceful my life became. I didn't post anything online. I didn't show off. I just worked, built, and grew. And as the company's name began appearing in industry magazines and finance blogs, I realized something poetic. Some of those very banks that had rejected me years ago were now reaching out to buy my software. But fate had one more twist waiting. One afternoon, my assistant brought me a proposal. An old local bank was struggling and looking for acquisition offers. The same one where I had once stood at the counter, humiliated and ignored when I asked for a small loan. I stared at the name for a long moment, the letters swimming on the page. That was the bank my brother used to joke about. "What's next, you'll buy it," he'd laughed. I smiled for the first time in years, not out of arrogance, but in disbelief at how the universe worked. I didn't make an impulsive move. I studied their reports, their losses, their debts, and finally made an offer. Weeks later, the deal closed. I became the owner of that same bank, my bank now, not theirs. Walking through its halls for the first time as the new owner felt surreal. The old wooden desks, the familiar smell of paper and coffee, it was all the same, yet everything had changed. But the real meaning wasn't in the ownership. The bank wasn't just a building or a business to me, it was a symbol. A monument to every laugh, every insult, every door that had been slammed in my face. I didn't buy it to flaunt wealth, I bought it to close a chapter. Standing in the manager's office, the same office that once denied me, I looked out the window and thought about that $100 loan. It was never just about money. It was about faith in myself when no one else had it. And now, I realized something profound: revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers in boardrooms, signs contracts, and builds empires in silence. That day, I didn't call my family to gloat. I didn't tell them a word. Because the sweetest kind of power is the one that doesn't need to be announced. It simply exists, quiet, steady, undeniable. Years passed, and life had a way of circling back. My company had grown beyond anything I ever imagined: new offices, international clients, a reputation in the finance world that spoke for itself. I had everything I once dreamed of: stability, respect, peace. Then, one evening, I received a message from my sister. It was short and hesitant, the kind of message you send when you need something. "Hey, can we talk? It's important." When we finally met, she looked older, tired, and nervous. Over coffee, she explained that my parents were struggling financially. My father's business had gone under after a bad investment, my brother's debts were piling up, and they were on the verge of losing their home. I listened quietly, letting her speak. She sighed and said, "We're trying to get a small loan, but the bank rejected us. We were wondering if, maybe you could help." The irony almost made me laugh. They didn't know. They had no idea that the bank they were begging for mercy from now had my signature on every approval. But I stayed calm, pretending to think it over. "Which bank?" I asked casually. She named it, the same one they once mocked me for dreaming about. I nodded slowly, hiding the storm of emotions behind a steady smile. A few days later, my brother called. His tone was humble for the first time in years. "Look, I know we weren't always supportive," he began awkwardly, "but you've always been good with people. Maybe you could talk to someone at the bank for us? We just need a second chance." His words carried a mix of desperation and pride, as if asking for help was its own punishment. I told him I'd see what I could do and asked him to meet me there the next morning. When they walked into the bank, they looked small and nervous, defeated, clutching papers and hopes. They didn't even glance at the nameplate on the office door when I led them in. But when they sat down, my father finally noticed. His eyes narrowed as he read the small plaque, "Owner and Executive Director," protagonist's name. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's face turned pale, my brother looked like he'd swallowed his words. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I simply said, "Now, tell me about the loan." That moment wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about closure. The same people who once laughed at my dreams were now speechless in front of the reality they refused to believe in. Their silence was louder than any apology could ever be. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air in that office felt heavy, like the years of judgment and laughter had suddenly condensed into silence. My father kept glancing at the plaque on my desk, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. My mother's eyes shimmered, a mix of pride and guilt fighting for space on her face. My brother sat perfectly still, his usual arrogance gone, replaced by something I'd never seen before: humility. I leaned back in my chair, not to intimidate them, but to take in the scene. The irony of it all was almost poetic. Years ago, I had sat across this same desk, begging for a small loan. Back then, I was dismissed with polite smiles and quiet mockery. Now, I sat here on the other side, calm, composed, and in complete control. "I'll approve the loan," I said quietly, signing the papers. "But this time, not because you're family. Because everyone deserves a chance to start over." My father opened his mouth, perhaps to apologize or explain, but I gently raised a hand. "It's okay," I added. "You don't owe me words. Life already said everything that needed to be said." They nodded slowly, eyes downcast, and stood to leave. As the door closed behind them, I finally exhaled. There was no anger left, no bitterness, only peace. I realized then that revenge isn't about making others suffer, it's about healing yourself so completely that their opinions no longer matter. I didn't need their validation anymore. The silence they left behind was all the closure I'd ever wanted. Karma had spoken, softly, beautifully, and on time. Sometimes, silence is the loudest apology. When those who once mocked you can't even find words, you realize revenge isn't about payback, it's about growth. That $100 wasn't a loan, it was the seed of faith that no one else saw. Success doesn't need an audience. Because when you finally make it, the laughter that once haunted you becomes your victory song, quiet, powerful, and unforgettable.